Everybody, I'm back with another video. This video is going to be analyzing Chelsea versus Manchester United in the English Premier League, and it's going to be made using Keyframe. So don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, but let's get right into it. So the first phase of the game that we're going to be looking at is Chelsea's defensive organization and Manchester United's offensive organization phase. So Chelsea's front three in the defensive phase put Drew in the central striker position at the 9, and they oftentimes look to press from right to left, as we see here with the annotation, with Drew cutting off one side and then wrapping around to press the central defender in the right half space. But with the front three, there's a few key things that we have to think about, and that's the Manchester United double pivot. Their interactions often favored horizontal movement and rotations between the two of them. They were quite comfortable dropping deeper as the play moved higher up the field, or rotating into higher positions and using blindside movements. So one way Chelsea dealt with this was the use of cover shadows. So when Drew would press, he would try and use his cover shadow as well as have the support of his narrow wingers or inside forwards. And with this, there would also be Kovacic and Conte who would cover the press and be able to jump, who were then in turn covered by the three central defenders, using their versatility to then jump and cover the players in the first two lines. So then we see Maguire on the ball, creating a back three with De Gea, and the wide players, the fullbacks, creating the width in the build-up phase. So now, when Giroud, his press is initiated, we see Kovacic start to jump, which creates access to Scott McTominay, so that he isn't now a free player. He has multiple players from Chelsea creating access to him. Mason Mount stays connected into the half space, ready to press the wide central defender as Giroud puts pressure on the ball. Same with Callum Hudson-Odoi. So as the press starts, the front three actually remain relatively unchanged, with Giroud going and the two inside forwards holding their position in the half space, creating access and creating a higher level of spatial control around the double pivot of Manchester United. From here, Giroud, as we said he would, presses from inside to out, and with Mount holding his position, not being triggered to press right away, using his cover shadow to block any Manchester United players that would be in behind him, and with the two players in the center, Kovacic and Ziyech, they're controlling the double pivot because a pass to the weak side is highly unlikely because of the pressing of Giroud and forcing the Manchester United attack to go through the wide area. So now, when Mason Mount is initiated to press, sometimes there are a few moments like this when he didn't use his cover shadow as accurately as he could have, where one, he didn't check his shoulder before he went, or he didn't scan the surrounding environment. So this opened up the half space for Manchester United to then play into the fullback or winger, dropping deeper. As well, the other concepts we can see is the jumping and the vertical partnership between Kovacic and Rudiger. So with Mason Greenwood dropping deeper, this initiates Rudiger to jump with him so that a free player isn't between the lines. So not only is there a vertical partnership between Giroud when his pressing is initiated, but also between Rudiger and Kovacic, all operating to maintain these access to the Manchester United players and using man orientation in this sense to then close down the outlets for Manchester United's build-up. Wingback of Chelsea, Ben Chilwell, applying pressure to the wide forward and the man orientation on the inside channels from Chelsea to to try and isolate possession in the wide area. So even without accurate use of the cover shadow, Chelsea are still well covered in the space in the wide area higher up the field to isolate possession. So now, when Chelsea have the ball, Manchester United played in a 4-2-3-1 as they usually do. Chelsea went with their back three in the build-up phase, as well as their double pivot, and one key tendency they had, especially in the midfield third, was the double pivot for Chelsea would drop deeper to minimize the space between their first and second line of build-up, and this forced Manchester United to have the reaction of playing very narrow and flat in their first two lines, so it was almost a 4-2-4 at times, but their base situation was a 4-2-3-1 with Mason Greenwood using his cover shadow to control one of the pivots, the wide midfielders starting more narrow to then create a higher level of spatial control in the central corridors, and Bruno Fernandes jumping as we see here to cover more Conte as Mason Greenwood uses his cover shadow against Kovacic. But this opened the potential for players like Rudiger to then advance in the half space via dribbling. We have our back three, not all in the picture, a little bit of asymmetry with the staggering of Christensen in the central corridor. We have Conte and Kovacic, and we can see their orientation to their first line very deep, which pushes the wide midfielders of Manchester United higher up the field, creating access to the central defender. But with the asymmetry, Daniel James has a farther distance press, then allowing Rudiger to progress via dribbling in the half space potentially because of this asymmetry in their movement and because of the positioning of their double pivot between the wide players and the central forward, and this narrows the pressing structure of Manchester United. And then we obviously see Bruno Fernandes covering the front three by jumping as well. So now Rudiger in the wide position, Manchester United would press in to out, meaning they would force Chelsea into the wide areas, as we see their 4-2-3-1 shape. With Mason Greenwood, usually we would see forwards more typically play a little bit higher to cut off circulation, but in some instances this was left open, especially in the high block, because they always had Mendy as a safety option, so circulation was almost guaranteed at this point, so Mason Greenwood rather controlled the pivot area than step out. When Chelsea would move higher up the field, as we see with Rudiger, as we talked, he progressed via dribbling in the half space because of the asymmetry in the first line of build-up, but as Chelsea moved higher up the field, we saw the width being created by the two wing-backs, as they have been in the past few matches, through Callum Hudson-Odoi and Ben Chilwell in this game, and now we start to see the dynamics of the midfield four, the two double pivots, Mason Mount and Ziyech, occupying the space between the lines and the platform area in relation to Manchester United's defensive system, and Giroud often favored one side, especially the second half. We'll see Giroud often favored the half spaces rather than the center, and we can talk about the dynamics of that later, but with Giroud pinning the back four, occupying the two center defenders, this created a man-to-man marking system between the two holding midfielders of Manchester United and the Chelsea offensive midfielders. So as we highlight the double pivot, we can see their orientation to the wide players of Chelsea, and now we can highlight their 4-2-3-1, and oftentimes their Bruno Fernandes dropping deeper in the blocks. He would often move as more of a second striker rather than an attacking midfielder or part of the midfield block, and their wingers would have a tendency to stay higher in relation to the back three and the wide center backs for transition purposes. But now looking at the Chelsea defensive structure against Manchester United, they played with a 5-man back line, often turned into a 3-man midfield, almost as a 5-3-2 with 2 forwards, and this was pretty much in the deeper areas, and this often dealt well with the Manchester United overloads between Luke Shaw occupying the wide area, Bruno Fernandes, or players like Rashford coming between the lines and moving. So we have our 2 defenders, center defenders, and often Fred or McTominay would drop deeper as a 3rd central defender. But with Scott McTominay as the pivot here, he offers an option in the platform area to then springboard and use this overload, with Mason Greenwood then coming over towards the left half space and creating these wide structures, with Bruno Fernandes operating as more of a free role in these positions between the lines to then work off his teammates who are pinning or creating space, and then he often finds pockets, although this was not quite effective because of Chelsea's compactness and their tight defensive structure. So, as we see in the second half, oftentimes the most central defender would then have time to go and progress the ball a little bit via dribbling. We saw that happen quite a bit. We still have the double pivot, and now we can see where things start to change, where Giroud often played in the left half space in the second half, higher up the field, and Ziyech would then play through the center. So it was a little bit different dynamics in the first half, but the midfield 3, the true midfield 3, with Mason Mount in the attacking midfield position, often saw Giroud either go into the left half space to pin the center for Ziyech, or saw him pinning on the right half space for Mason Mount. Then the wingbacks would create width and height as they did the whole match, and Manchester United's defensive setup didn't change with their 9 and 10 setup and their advanced wide midfielders and their man marking via their holding midfielders. And one of the switches with Giroud moving towards the half space more and Ziyech playing through the center, and allowed Ziyech to come into the 10 position and try and get between the lines on the ball. So as we see here, Ziyech playing as almost in the 9 position, and then now Giroud dropping between the lines, which isn't really his specialty, as we saw in the match, working these 3, having fluidity to overload the space between the lines, and overloading Fred, who's paired with Scott McTominay, as well as using Callum Hudson-Odoi in the wide areas to pin the fullback, and Ziyech pinning the 2 center defenders, so Giroud can then drop deeper unmarked. But again, his qualities didn't suit this role and was often ineffective. And then in transition, Manchester United, we saw their higher outside midfielders, and this was to promote a faster transition with more numbers against the Chelsea back 3, and primarily with the wide players running through the half spaces to try and unbalance the back 3, with Bruno Fernandes often dropping deeper as the target player to then springboard the counterattack, which was very vertical and very goal-oriented. So then the last picture now, just wanted to show with Giroud in the left half space, pinning the wide center back, Ziyech through the center, and Mason Mount in the wide area, and we see still the commitment from the Manchester United players to man orientation via their double pivot. So Fred drops deeper to cover Mason Mount. Scott McTominay is just a bit more central to then cover Ziyech, and Giroud is in the left half space to occupy the 2 center defenders, or just Lindelof. But from here, with Giroud playing a little bit wider and Ziyech through the center, this then creates the opportunity for Ziyech to be the player to drop deeper between the two holding midfielders and occupy the 10 role and get on the ball between the lines. Or if Giroud was the one to drop, so if we have Giroud dropping now to get on the ball between the lines, or just to pull out Lindelof as the player in the back, this would then create space in behind for Ziyech to run in behind and get on the ball via a third line pass. And that's the analysis, guys. Just wanted to make a quick one. A little bit under the weather, so sorry if my voice is a bit different. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.